Hello, I'm Peter. I'm so glad you could join me for tonight's journey. Close your eyes and imagine a morning so still that the only thing breaking the silence is the rhythm of a distant steeple. The bells of St. Arlen rang before dawn. Their sound rolled across the sleeping village like a gentle hand on a shoulder, calling the faithful to prayer, calling the weary to work, calling the world itself awake from the embrace of night. In the year 1324, in a small village outside York in the north of England, this was how each day began. Not with alarm clocks or radio voices or the glow of screens, but with bronze bells singing through the mist. If you closed your eyes and stood in that moment, you would feel the cold morning air on your face sharp enough to make your breath visible, but not yet cruel. You would hear the bells, yes, but also the stirring of birds in the hedgerows, the distant lowing of cattle, the creak of wooden shutters being pushed open by hands stiff with sleep. You would smell wood smoke beginning to curl from the chimneys, and beneath it, something else. Something warm and yeasty and alive. Bread. Not the bread you know from the supermarket shelf, soft and white and lasting for weeks without a thought. No, this was different. This was bread that had been waiting all night to be born, bread that had lived and breathed and risen in the darkness while the village slept. Bread that in a very real sense was the village itself, its labor, its faith, its hope made tangible and warm and good enough to hold in your hands. But here's what might surprise you. Here's the thing that makes this story worth telling, worth remembering, worth carrying with you into sleep tonight. Those people, those medieval peasants who lived on bread, who drew 70% of their daily sustenance from loaves baked in communal ovens, who consumed 2, sometimes 3 pounds of it every single day. They weren't suffering. They weren't weak or sickly or desperate. They were in their own way strong, resilient, connected to their food and to each other in ways we've almost forgotten how to imagine. Forget the images you might have from movies or school books. Forget the idea of the Middle Ages as a dark, miserable time of ignorance and starvation. The truth, as always, is more complicated, more interesting, and in some ways, more beautiful than we've been led to believe. Tonight, we're going to walk through a single season in the life of a village. We're going to meet a woman named Elara, a widow who works the fields and bakes her bread and raises her son in the shadow of that stone church where the bells still ring. We're going to discover how something as simple as grain and water and time could become sacred, could become community, could become quite literally the difference between life and death, between isolation and belonging, between hunger and home. This isn't a story about deprivation. It's a story about abundance of a different kind. The abundance that comes when people know how to be patient. When they understand that the best things, the things worth having, cannot be rushed or manufactured or bought from a shelf. They must be grown, nurtured, shared. We're going to explore the mystery of ancient grains that stood taller than a man, each stalk unique, each field a living library of genetic diversity that protected entire communities from famine. We're going to visit the mill where stone wheels, turned by wind and water, ground those grains into flour, so fresh you could smell the earth still in it. We're going to watch as dough mixed with nothing more than water and salt, and time transforms into something that could sustain a family through the harshest winter. And along the way, we're going to discover something unexpected. We're going to find that the medieval peasant, the person we've been taught to pity, might actually have known something profound that we've lost in our modern rush toward convenience and speed. They knew that food isn't just fuel. It's connection, it's ritual, it's love made visible. So settle in a little deeper now. Pull that blanket closer. Let your breathing slow and soften. We have all the time in the world, and there's nowhere else you need to be. The village of St. Arlen is waiting for us just beyond the veil of centuries. And Elara is already awake, stepping out into that cold dawn, her hands rough from work, but warm with purpose. Are you ready? Then let's begin. Let's discover together how bread, simple and humble and made from the dust of the earth, became the quiet miracle that kept an entire civilization alive. Not just in body, but in spirit. The journey starts now. Close your eyes if you'd like, and just listen. The first thing Elara felt each morning was the cold. Not the sharp, bitter cold that comes later in the year when frost etches patterns on the inside of windows and breath freezes in beards and eyelashes. No, this was the gentle cold of early autumn 1324. The kind that makes you grateful for the weight of a wool blanket, for the lingering warmth of the body beside you. Except there was no body beside Elara anymore. Thomas had been gone 3 winters now. The pestilence had taken him the way it took so many quietly in the night, leaving her with a small son and a strip of land she barely knew how to work alone. She rose before the bells as she always did. Some habits run deeper than grief. Her home was small. 1 room really, with a loft where young William slept, his breathing soft and steady above her. The walls were wattle and daub-woven branches, plastered with a mixture of clay, straw and dung that dried hard enough to keep out most of the wind. The floor was packed, earth swept clean each evening, scattered with dried rushes that released a faint herbal scent when stepped upon. In the corner, the embers of last night's fire still glowed faintly in the central hearth, and Elara moved to them first, coaxing them back to life with dry kindling and her own patient breath. As the flames caught and grew, they illuminated the few possessions she owned. A wooden chest that had been her mother's, a spinning wheel she used on winter evenings, an iron pot suspended over the fire. And there on the small table near the door, wrapped in a clean cloth, yesterday's bread. She touched it like you might touch something sacred. And in a way, it was. Outside, the darkness was beginning to soften at its edges. Not quite dawn yet, but no longer full night. This was the hour she loved most. The hour when the world seemed to pause between sleeping and waking, when you could hear your own thoughts clearly, when prayer felt less like words and more like breathing. Elara pulled her cloak around her shoulders, the rough wool already familiar with the shape of her body after so many years. She stepped out into the cool air and closed the door softly behind her so as not to wake William. He needed his sleep. Growing boys always did, and God knew there was little enough to fill his belly these days without him wasting strength on worry. The village of St. Arlen spread before her in the half-light, perhaps 30 cottages in all, each with its own small garden plot, its own thin ribbon of smoke beginning to rise into the sky. Beyond them, the fields. And beyond the fields, dark and solid against the lightening sky, the forest that no one entered unless they had to. The old stories said things lived there, things older than the church, older than the village, older perhaps than memory itself. But Elara didn't think much about the old stories anymore. She had work to do. Her strip of land lay on the north edge of the communal fields, a long, narrow piece that stretched away toward the rising sun. It wasn't much. Perhaps 3 acres in total scattered across the 3 great fields that the village worked in rotation. This year, her main strip was planted with a mixture that the old men called maslin wheat and rye, growing together in the same soil, their roots intertwined, their fates linked. Her grandfather had taught her about maslin when she was just a girl. Never put all your faith in one seed. He'd said, his voice rough as tree bark from a lifetime of shouting across windy fields. The wheat might fail in a wet year, but the rye will stand. The rye might lodge in a dry year, but the wheat will hold. Together, they keep a family alive. She remembered his hands as he'd set it broad and scarred and gentle when they touched the growing grain. She remembered how he'd let her hold the seeds wheat and rye mixed together in her small palm, and how she'd marveled that she could tell them apart just by touch. The wheat was plumper, smoother. The rye was longer, thinner, with a slight sharpness to its ends. Even as a child, she'd understood this wasn't just farming. It was wisdom. It was survival. Now those same fields belonged to her, or at least the right to work them did. The land itself belonged to the Lord, of course, as did nearly everything else. But the sweat that fell on it, the prayers whispered over it, the hope invested in each seed, those were hers alone. She walked along the edge of her strip, now her feet finding the familiar path even in the dim light. The grain was nearly ready. You could tell by the way it bowed under its own weight, the heads heavy with seed, the stalks no longer green, but going golden. In another week, perhaps 2, if the weather held, it would be time for harvest. And then the real work would begin. But that was future worry. Right now, in this moment, she could simply walk and observe and be grateful that the season had been kind. No hail to beat down the crop, no blight to blacken the stems, no armies marching through to trample what they didn't steal. Just steady sun and adequate rain, and the patient turning of the seasons as they had turned for her grandfather's grandfather, and would turn, God willing, for William and his children after him. She bent to touch one of the wheat heads, feeling the individual grains firm beneath their protective husks. This particular patch was einkorn, the ancient strain that her family had always saved seed from, year after year, generation after generation. It stood taller than her head, and the grain inside was small but remarkably dense, with a flavor that was almost nutty, almost sweet. It didn't yield as much as the newer varieties some villagers were trying, but it never failed completely either. Even in the worst years, even when everything else withered, the einkorn would produce something. This is what people don't understand when they think about medieval farming. Elara would have told you if you could ask her. They imagine vast fields all planted to one crop row after orderly row, like the fields you see from airplane windows today. But that's not how it worked. Each family's strip was its own experiment in diversity. Here, a patch of einkorn there, some emmer wheat. Over there, spelt mixed with barley. Along the edge, peas and beans climbing up dead branches stuck into the ground to give them support. The diversity wasn't just practical, although it certainly was that. It was also beautiful. The different grains ripened at slightly different times, so the field became a patchwork of colors, deep green bleeding into gold, bleeding into the russet brown of fully ripe rye. And the heights varied too. The modern dwarf wheat hadn't been invented yet. These grains grew as tall as their genetics, and the soil allowed some rising 6 feet or more, creating a kind of gentle golden forest that whispered and rustled when the wind moved through it. Elara stood there for a long moment, just listening to that whisper. It was a sound that had comforted her since childhood, a sound that meant everything was as it should be, that the earth was keeping its promises, that hunger could be held at bay for another year. The grain was speaking to itself in a language older than words, older than Latin prayers, or Norman French or Anglo-Saxon grunts. It was the language of life itself, of chlorophyll and sunlight and soil chemistry, working in perfect concert to take nothing, air and water and minerals, and turn it into everything, into food, into hope, into tomorrow. A bird called from the hedgerow, sharp and insistent, a lark announcing the day, and as if in answer, the first rim of the sun broke over the eastern horizon, spilling light across the fields like liquid gold. The transformation was instantaneous and complete. What had been grey and shadowy a moment before now blazed with colour and life. The grain seemed to glow from within. The dew on the spiderwebs stretched between stalks caught the light and became strings of diamonds. And far away from the direction of the village, the bells began to ring. She smiled just a little. Thank you, she thought, though she wasn't entirely sure who she was thanking. God, probably, or the earth, or her grandfather's ghost still walking these fields in some form beyond her seeing. Thank you for this. Thank you for enough. Because that's what it came down to in the end. Not wealth, not luxury, just enough. Enough grain to make bread, enough bread to feed a child, enough strength to face another day. In 1324, in a village outside York in the life of a widow named Elara, that was all the abundance anyone could ask for. And it was in its own quiet way a kind of miracle. She turned back toward the cottage. William would be waking soon, and there was yesterday's bread to break, and after that the day's work waiting. But for this one moment, standing in her field with the sun on her face and the grain whispering its ancient promises, she felt something close to contentment, close to peace. The bread on her table hadn't come from a store or a factory or even a professional baker. It had come from this, from seeds saved and soil tended and seasons honored. It had come from the same earth that would one day receive her body that had already received Thomas's. There was a circle to it, a completeness that made sense in a way that few things in life ever do. She couldn't know that 700 years in the future, people would look back at her life and marvel. They would study her grain and her methods and wonder at how she and her neighbours had sustained themselves on something so simple. They would write papers and conduct experiments and slowly, painfully begin to understand that perhaps the old ways hadn't been primitive at all. Perhaps they'd been wise in ways that modern efficiency had forgotten how to measure. But Elara didn't need to know any of that. All she needed was right here, the field, the grain, the promise of bread. And that was enough. That was everything. She walked back to the cottage, her feet leaving dark tracks in the dew-silvered grass, and opened the door to the sound of William stirring in the loft above. Another day was beginning, and there was bread to be made. By the time the sun cleared the trees, Elara and William had already finished their first meal. It wasn't much. A thick slice of yesterday's bread, dense and dark, and slightly sour in the way that naturally leavened bread always is. A cup of small beer weak enough that even a child could drink it safely. The beer was important because the water from the stream, while it looked clear enough, could turn your stomach inside out if you drank it straight. But the brewing process, even the simple brewing they did at home, made it safe. Another small miracle that no one quite understood, but everyone relied upon. William ate his portion quickly, the way growing boys do, as if he hadn't eaten in days rather than hours. He was 7 now, old enough to help in the fields, though still too young for the heavier work. His hair was the same dark brown as Thomas's had been, and sometimes when he turned his head a certain way, Elara's breath caught at the resemblance. But she tried not to let him see those moments. Children shouldn't have to carry their parents' grief. "Can I come with you today?" he asked, wiping crumbs from his mouth with the back of his hand. "To the field." She pretended to consider, though they both knew the answer. "I suppose I could use a strong pair of hands. The weeds won't pull themselves." His face lit up. This was the game they had played since he was old enough to walk. She would pretend he was doing her a favor by helping, and he would pretend he didn't know she was being kind. It was a small fiction, but it preserved his dignity, and dignity mattered even when you had nothing else. They walked to the field together, William chattering about a dream he'd had involving a talking goat and a feast in the Lord's Hall. Elara listened with half her attention, the other half already on the work ahead. The weeds had gotten ahead of her these past weeks. They always did this time of year, growing thick and bold in the late summer sun, trying to steal nutrients from the grain that needed them most. When they reached her strip, she set William to work on the bean patch while she moved to the main grain field. She showed him how to pull gently but firmly, getting the whole root if possible, and how to lay the pulled weeds aside to dry in the sun before adding them to the compost heap. Everything had a use. Nothing was wasted. Then she turned to her own task. Weeding grain is delicate work. The plants grow so close together that you have to be careful not to damage the wheat while you're removing the intruders. Elara knelt in the dirt, her skirts tucked up, to keep them from the damp earth, and began to work her way down the row. Her hands moved with the practiced ease of someone who'd been doing this since childhood. Identify the weed by touch and sight. Grasp it near the base. Pull with steady pressure. Shake the roots free of soil. Move to the next. It was mindless work in the best way. The kind of work that lets your thoughts wander while your hands stay busy. And as she worked, she thought about bread. Not the eating of it, but the making. The long, patient process that began here in this field and wouldn't end until the loaf emerged from the oven weeks from now. It was a process that involved the entire village, really. No one person could do it all alone, though. In desperate times they might try. But it worked. Better worked properly when it was a communal effort, when everyone played their part. First would come the harvest. That would be soon now, perhaps a fortnight away. The entire village would turn out for it, even the oldest grandmothers and the youngest children who could hold a gathering cloth. It would take days, maybe a full week, depending on the weather, and everyone would work from dawn until it was too dark to see. The grain would be cut with sickles bound into sheaves and left in the field to dry for a few more days before being gathered into the tithe barn. And there was a rub, the tithe barn. Because before Elara could take her grain anywhere, before she could even think about grinding it into flour, she had to give the church its due. 1 sheaf in every 10 belonged to God, which in practical terms meant it belonged to the priest and the distant bishop he served. It was the law, the expectation, the price of living in a Christian land. Some years this felt fair enough. God had blessed the crop after all, so returning a portion seemed right and proper. But other years when the yield was thin and William's ribs were starting to show and the winter looked long and dark ahead. Other years it felt like theft, even if you didn't dare say so out loud. Still, it had to be paid. And after the tithe, there was another portion for the lord of the manor. More grain going into someone else's barn while her own stores stayed lean. But that too was the way of things. The Lord provided protection after all and the right to work this land. In theory, anyway. She'd never actually seen the Lord who preferred his estates down south, where the weather was gentler and the society more refined. But she'd seen his steward, a hard man with cold eyes, who counted every sheaf and knew to the ounce what was owed. After the tithes and the rents, what remained was hers. And from that remainder she had to save enough seed for next year's planting. This was sacred, inviolable. You could be starving, could be watching your children waste away, and still you didn't touch the seed grain. Because to eat your seed was to eat your future. It was to give up. And Elara had learned many things in her 30 years of life, but giving up wasn't one of them. What remained after all that? Maybe half the harvest if she was lucky. That was what fed them for the year. That was what became bread. She paused in her weeding to wipe sweat from her forehead. The sun was climbing higher now, and the day was warming. Across the field she could see other villagers at work on their own strips. Old Gerard, who moved slowly, but never stopped, his gnarled hands still capable of surprising strength. Young Alice, newer to the village, having married the blacksmith's son last spring. And there, near the far edge, was Margaret with her 3 daughters, all of them working in silent coordination that came from years of shared labour. Elara lifted a hand in greeting, and Margaret returned the gesture. They were too far apart for conversation, but the acknowledgement was enough. We see you. We're in this together. The unspoken language of neighbours who depended on each other for survival. By midday, Elara's hands were aching, and her back was screaming for relief. She'd cleared perhaps 1/3 of the weeds from her main strip, which meant she'd be at this for several more days at least. But it had to be done. Those weeds would steal nutrients the grain desperately needed for filling out its seeds. Every weed she pulled now meant denser, heavier grain at harvest, meant more flour, meant more bread, meant survival. She called William over, and they shared their midday meal together in the shade of the hedgerow. More bread, of course. This time with a scraping of the last of the butter from the cow they shared with 2 other families. The bread was good. Dense and chewy with a complex flavour that came from the mix of grains and the wild yeasts that had leavened it. It took real chewing, real work to eat, which was satisfying in its own way. Your jaw got tired before your stomach got full, which helped the food last longer. "Tell me about the bread," William said suddenly through a mouthful of crust. "What about it? How it's made? Grandfather used to tell me, but I've forgotten some of it." Elara smiled. Thomas's father had loved to explain things, to pass on the knowledge he'd accumulated over 7 decades of life. She still missed his voice, cracked and warm, like old leather left in the sun. "Well," She began settling back against the hedge. "It starts right here, with the grain we're growing. But you knew that already." "Tell me anyway," he said. And so she did. She told him about the harvest, about how they'd cut each stalk carefully to avoid shattering the precious seeds, about how they'd bundle the stalks into sheaves and tie them with grass rope and stack them in stooks to finish drying, about how they'd eventually thresh the grain by beating the sheaves with flails on a clean floor, separating the seeds from the straw. "And then," he prompted, "then comes the winnowing. We toss the grain into the air on a windy day, and the chaff, that's the light outer covering, blows away while the heavier grain falls back into the basket. It takes patience. If the wind's too strong, you lose grain. Too weak, and the chaff won't separate. And then to the mill. And then to the mill," she confirmed. "We'll take a portion of our grain to Miller John, and he'll grind it between his stones. The mill belongs to the Lord, of course, so we have to pay for the service. Usually 1 measure in every 16, but it's worth it. Trying to grind grain by hand with a quernstone is back-breaking work, and the flour never comes out as fine. And then you make the dough. Then I make the dough, yes. Mix the flour with water and a bit of starter from the last batch. The starter is what makes it rise. It's full of tiny creatures too small to see that eat the flour and breathe out air. That air gets trapped in the dough and makes it expand." William wrinkled his nose. "There are creatures in our bread. Living things anyway. Same as makes the beer ferment and the cheese ripen. They're everywhere, really. In the air, in the soil, on our skin. Most of them are helpful, or at least harmless. It's only certain kinds you have to worry about." She didn't tell him about the ergot that sometimes infected rye, turning the grain purple-black and poisonous, or about the moldy flour that could make you sick, or even kill you if the storage wasn't properly dry. There were enough real worries in the world without adding to a child's collection of them. "After I mix the dough," she continued, "I let it sit overnight, sometimes longer in the winter when it's cold. The starter needs a time to do its work to transform the heavy lump into something light and alive. Then in the morning, I shape it and let it rise again. And then when the oven is hot enough, I bake it. And that's when it smells so good," William said with satisfaction. "That's when it smells so good," she agreed. "Like, oh, I don't know, like home, like safety, like everything's going to be all right, even when you know it might not be." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the rustle of grain and the distant call of birds. The bread they'd just eaten sat warm and solid in their bellies, doing exactly what it was supposed to do, keeping hunger at bay, providing strength for the afternoon's work ahead. This was the covenant, Elara thought, the unspoken agreement between the earth and those who worked it. You give the soil your sweat, your prayers, your faith, that the seeds will grow, and in return, the soil gives you grain, and the grain gives you flour, and the flour gives you bread, and the bread gives you life itself, one day at a time, one loaf at a time, one bite at a time. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't easy. Your back hurt, and your hands bled, and there were years when it all went wrong despite your best efforts, when the rain wouldn't stop or wouldn't come, when blight took the crop, or soldiers took your stores, or simple bad luck meant you went to bed hungry more often than not. But it was real. It was honest. It was a kind of relationship with your food that most people in ages to come would never experience, would never even imagine. You knew exactly where your bread came from, because you'd been there for every step of its creation. You'd planted the seed, and pulled the weeds, and cut the stalk, and threshed the grain, and ground the flour, and mixed the dough, and watched it bake. Your bread wasn't something purchased thoughtlessly from a shelf. It was something earned, something made, something sacred. "Come on," she said, getting to her feet with a groan her tired muscles immediately endorsed. "Those weeds won't pull themselves." "You said that already," William pointed out, grinning. "Did I? Well, it's still true." They worked through the afternoon, mother and son side by side, their hands dark with earth, their faces bright with sun. And when they finally walked back to the cottage as the light began to fail, Elara felt the good kind of tired. The kind that comes from honest work. The kind that means you'll sleep soundly and wake ready to do it all again. Because that was the truth of it, she thought, as she prepared their simple evening meal. That was the secret the future would forget. Bread wasn't just nutrition, it was continuity. It was the physical manifestation of human patience, of our willingness to plant in spring what we won't eat until autumn, to save in autumn what we'll need in spring, to defer gratification, to trust in tomorrow even when today was hard. Every loaf was an act of faith, and every bite was a small prayer of gratitude to whatever force, divine or natural, had allowed the seed to sprout and the grain to grow and the bread to rise. In the cottage, by the light of a single tallow candle, she cut 2 more slices from yesterday's loaf. Tomorrow she'd bake again, and the cycle would continue, as it had for her grandmother and her grandmother before that. As it would, God willing, for William's children and their children after them. The bread was all they had, really. But in 1324, in a village outside York, in the life of a woman named Elara, it was also all they needed. 3 days later, Elara made her way to the mill. She carried a sack on her back, heavy with grain she'd saved from last year's harvest. This was the portion that would become this month's flour, carefully measured and guarded since the autumn threshing. The sack pulled at her shoulders, making her lean forward slightly to balance the weight. But she didn't mind. This was good weight, purposeful weight, the weight of survival. The path to the mill followed the stream that gave it power. Even from a distance she could hear the great wheel turning, the splash and gurgle of water being forced through the race, the deep grinding rumble of stone on stone. It was a sound that had been part of the village's life for longer than anyone could remember, as constant and dependable as the bells of St. Arlen. The mill itself stood a little apart from the main village, positioned where the stream dropped just enough to give the water useful force. It was a larger building than any cottage built of stone, rather than wattle and daub, with a steep thatched roof to shed rain and snow. The Lord's mark was carved above the door, a reminder that this too belonged to him, that the miller was his man, and that every villager who needed grain ground paid for the privilege. John the miller emerged from the doorway as she approached, wiping flour from his hands on his apron. He was a large man, made larger by the perpetual dusting of flour that clung to his clothes and hair and beard, turning him ghostly white in certain lights. But his eyes were kind, and his hands, though massive, were gentle when they needed to be. "Elara," he greeted her with a nod. "Brought your month's grain?" "I have, if you've time to grind it today." "For you, always." He hefted the sack easily, weighing it by feel. Looks about right. Should give you enough flour for 3, maybe 4 bakings. How's the boy? Growing. Eating me out of house and home. John laughed, a deep rumbling sound that matched the millstones. That's what boys do. Mine are the same, and they're near grown men now. It doesn't get better, I'm afraid. Just more expensive. She followed him into the mill, stepping from bright sunlight into cool dimness. The interior was a study in organized chaos. Sacks of grain lined one wall, each marked with its owner's symbol. Sacks of freshly ground flour lined another. In the center of the space, dominating everything, were the millstones themselves. 2 massive circles of granite, the upper one slowly rotating above the lower, driven by a complex system of gears and shafts that transferred the power from the water wheel outside. The stones were works of art, really, though few people ever thought of them that way. Each had been carved with intricate furrows that spiraled out from the center patterns designed to move the grain from the eye where it was fed in toward the edge where the flour emerged. John's father had cut these stones, and his father before him, each generation maintaining and refining the patterns, passing down the knowledge of exactly how deep each groove should be, how rough the surface, how true the rotation. The stones are running well today, John said with satisfaction, checking the gap between them with a practiced eye. Not too close, not too far. Should give you a nice medium grind, unless you want it finer. Elara shook her head. Medium is good. I like some texture to the bread. Wise woman. The fine white flour the Lord demands for his table. It's pretty, I'll grant you, but there's no strength in it. No flavor. Give me good, honest brown flour any day. You can taste the earth in it. He poured her grain into the hopper, a wooden funnel that fed the stones, and adjusted the rate of flow with a small wooden gate. Too much grain at once, and the stones would bind. Too little, and they'd run hot and damage both the stones and the flour. It was all about balance, about patience, about paying attention to the subtle changes in sound that told you everything was working as it should. As the grain began to disappear into the stones, John gestured for Elara to follow him outside. The noise level in the mill was too high for comfortable conversation, and there were things he wanted to say. They stood by the mill pond, watching the water slide smoothly over the wheel's buckets, each one filling and dumping in an endless cycle. It was mesmerizing in its own way, the kind of repetitive motion that could lull you into a meditative state if you let it. I've been meaning to speak with you, John said quietly, about the harvest coming. What about it? Robert the steward was here yesterday, checking the mill accounts, he said, but really he was warning me. The Lord wants his rent paid in full this year. No exceptions, no excuses, even if the harvest is lean. Elara felt something cold settle in her stomach. It's never been lean 3 years running, not in my memory, nor mine. But that won't matter to Robert. He has his orders and he'll carry them out. I just thought you should know. Plan accordingly. She nodded slowly, her mind already working through calculations. Her strip wasn't large to begin with. After the tithe and the Lord's portion and the seed grain, what was left had to feed herself and William for an entire year. If the Lord was demanding more this time, she'd have to find ways to stretch what remained even further. Use more barley and less wheat. Maybe add some peas to the bread flour to bulk it out. It wouldn't taste as good, but taste was a luxury she might not be able to afford. Thank you for the warning, she said. We look after our own, John replied simply. Always have. Always will, God willing. They stood in companionable silence for a while, watching the water and the wheel and the sunlight dancing on the pond's surface. This was one of the things Elara loved about the mill. It was never quite still, never quite silent. Even when the stones weren't running, there was the water to listen to the creaking of the wheel, the rustling of the willows that grew along the bank. It was alive in a way that felt reassuring, eternal. "I've been thinking about bread," John said suddenly. Elara smiled. "Aren't we all?" "No, I mean really thinking about it, about what it means. My grandfather used to say that bread was the measure of a society. You could tell how a people were doing by the bread they ate. Not just whether they had enough, but what kind they had. Whether it was shared fairly, whether it was made with care, or just churned out as fast as possible." "Your grandfather was a wise man." "He was. And he'd be troubled by some of the things I've been seeing. Villages where the common oven has fallen into disrepair and no one can be bothered to fix it. Mills, where the stones are let go rough because the Lord won't pay for proper maintenance. People eating bread that's half sawdust because the grain's been stretched so thin trying to meet unreasonable demands. Is it that bad elsewhere?" "In some places, yes. We're fortunate here in St. Arlen. Father Benedict isn't greedy. The Lord is absent, but not cruel. We still have neighbours who help each other. But I've heard tales from the south. Tales that make me grateful for what we have, even when it seems like little enough." Inside the mill, the sound of the stones changed slightly, dropping in pitch. John's head came up immediately, his professional instincts alert. "That's your grain coming through now," he said. "Come on, let's go see." They went back inside, and Elara watched as the first flour began to emerge from between the stones, falling in a steady stream into the collection box below. It was beautiful in its way. Not white, but a warm beige colour flecked with darker bits of bran and germ. You could smell the wheat in it, fresh and slightly sweet, with undertones of the minerals from the stone itself. John caught a handful and rubbed it between his fingers, testing the texture. "Good grind," he pronounced. "Not too coarse, not too fine. Should make excellent bread." "It always does," Elara said. "You've never given me a bad batch yet. And I don't intend to start now. A miller's reputation is everything. People trust me with their grain, with their survival, really. That's not something I take lightly." As they waited for all her grain to pass through the stones, John told her about the history of the mill, how it had been built by the Lord's grandfather nearly 100 years ago, replacing an older mill that had stood on a different part of the stream. How the great wheel had been carved from a single oak tree that took a dozen men to fell and transport. How the stones had been quarried from a hill 20 miles away and brought here on specially built wagons pulled by teams of oxen. "They don't build like that anymore," he said with a touch of melancholy. "Everything's got to be quick now, cheap now, good enough now. No one thinks in generations anymore. No one builds something expecting their great-grandchildren to use it." But this mill would last, Elara thought. It was built to last. Built by people who understood that some things were worth doing properly, even if it took more time and effort. People who knew that a community needed certain anchors, certain constants, and a mill that turned grain into flour was one of them. When the last of her flour had been collected, John helped her fill her smaller sack. He took his payment in kind, as was customary, 1 measure of flour for every 16 ground. It seemed like a lot when you were hungry, but it was fair. The mill required constant maintenance. The stones needed dressing regularly to keep them sharp and true. The wheel needed repair. The building needed thatching. John had to feed his own family. And ultimately, none of them had much choice in the matter anyway. The Lord owned the mill, and these were the terms. "Before you go," John said, reaching into one of the sacks along the wall, "I wanted to give you something." He pulled out a small cloth bag and placed it in her hands. It was lighter than she expected, and when she opened it, she found seeds. Grain seeds, but of a type she didn't immediately recognize. "What is this?" "Spelt," John said. "An old variety. My wife's family has been growing it for generations up in the Dales. It's hardly resistant to rust and blight. Doesn't yield as much as wheat, but it never fails completely either. I thought you might want to try a small plot of it. Diversify a bit." Elara looked down at the seeds, then back up at John's flour-dusted face. This was kindness beyond the ordinary. Good seed was precious. To give it away, especially to someone who might not be able to return the favor, was an act of generosity that went straight to her heart. "I don't know what to say. Say you'll plant it. Say you'll save some seed from your harvest to pass along to someone else who needs it. That's how these old varieties survive. Not hoarded, but shared. Kept alive through the simple act of planting and harvesting and planting again. I will, I promise." "Good." He helped her settle the sack of flour onto her back, adjusting it so the weight distributed evenly. "Go carefully now. That flour's worth more than gold in its own way." She smiled at the familiar phrase. Her grandfather used to say the same thing. Gold might buy you temporary comfort. He'd say, but flour buys you life itself. Never forget which one's really valuable. Walking back to the cottage, Elara felt the weight of the flour and the lightness of hope warring in her chest. The warning about the Lord's demands was concerning, yes. But John's gift of the spelt seed was a reminder that good still existed in the world, that people still looked out for each other, that kindness like grain could be planted and harvested and shared. When she got home, she'd store the flour carefully in the wooden chest, keeping it dry and away from vermin. And tomorrow, or perhaps the day after, she'd begin the process of transforming it into bread. But tonight, she'd take a few minutes to examine the spelt seeds more closely, to imagine them growing in a corner of her field next year, adding their own strength to the diversity that kept her family alive. The mill's rhythm continued behind her as she walked the steady grinding of stone on stone, the splash of water on the wheel. It was the sound of civilization itself, she thought. The sound of humans taking what nature provided and transforming it through patience and skill and wisdom into something they could use, something they could share. And wasn't that what bread really was, a transformation? From seed to plant, to grain, to flour, to dough, to bread. From individual effort to communal resource. From simple sustenance to something approaching sacrament. The bells of St. Arlen began to ring the evening call to prayer. Elara shifted the sack on her back and quickened her pace. There was still time before full dark to prepare tomorrow's dough, to feed the starter that lived in its crock, by the hearth bubbling and alive, and ready to work its mysterious magic once again. The cycle continued. The wheel turned, the stones ground, the bread rose, and life, despite all its hardships, went on. The rain began on the feast day of St. Michael, as if the archangel himself had opened the heavens in some celestial battle beyond human seeing. At first, Elara was grateful for it. The late September heat had been oppressive, and the fields could use a good soaking before the final push toward harvest. She stood in her doorway and watched the first drops fall, feeling the temperature drop with them breathing in the smell of wet earth and wet stone and wet wood. That was somehow one of the most comforting scents in the world. But the rain didn't stop. Not that day, not the next, not the day after that. By the fourth day, the gratitude had turned to worry. By the seventh, the worry had hardened into fear. The grain in the fields, so close to being ready, was now at its most vulnerable. If it stayed wet too long, it would begin to sprout right there on the stalk, ruining it for storage and milling. Or worse, it might rot. She'd seen it happen before, years ago, when she was still a girl. A wet autumn had taken half the village's crop, and the winter that followed had been hungry and cold, and marked by the small wooden crosses in the churchyard that appeared with terrible regularity. Elara stood at her window on the 8th morning and looked out at a world transformed into grey water. The fields were more pond than land. The stream that powered the mill had swollen to 3 times its normal width, angry and brown, and carrying bits of fencing and uprooted bushes in its furious rush. The sky hung low and sullen with no promise of clearing. "Mama," William's voice was small behind her. "Is the grain going to be all right?" She wanted to lie to him. Wanted to say, of course it would be, that everything would be fine, that she'd kept them safe this long, and she wasn't about to fail now. But William was 7 old enough to understand that sometimes the world didn't care about your wants or needs or prayers. Sometimes bad things just happened, and all you could do was endure. "I don't know, sweetheart, but we'll manage. We always do." It was a thin reassurance, and they both knew it. When the rain finally stopped 3 days later, Elara slogged out to her field with her heart in her throat. What she found was worse than she'd feared. The grain that had been standing tall and proud 2 weeks ago was now beaten down, flattened by the weight of the water. Some of it had broken entirely, stalks snapped and lying in the mud. And in the places where water had pooled and stood, she could already see the telltale darkening that meant rot had begun its work. She knelt in the mud and lifted one of the broken stalks. The grain heads were swollen, misshapen. Some had already begun to sprout, sending out pale rootlets that would never find soil. This grain was lost, unusable even for animal feed. Around her, she could hear the sounds of other villagers discovering similar devastation. Someone was crying. Someone else was cursing a steady stream of profanity that would normally have earned a penance from Father Benedict, but today went unremarked. They were all too busy calculating their losses, trying to figure out how bad it was, whether they'd have enough to survive the winter. By the time the sun set that evening, the village had come together in the churchyard to take stock. Father Benedict stood on the church steps, his face grave, while people called out their estimates of what they'd lost. "1/3 of my crop," said old Gerard, his voice shaking. "Maybe more." "Half of mine," said Alice, her new husband's arm around her shoulders. "2/3. Someone else called out, and there was a collective intake of breath. When it came Elara's turn, she said quietly, "About half. Maybe a bit more. I won't know for certain until we get it cut and threshed." Father Benedict nodded, making notes on a piece of precious parchment. The steward will need to know," he said. "This was an act of God, not negligence. Surely the Lord will show mercy and reduce the rents this year." But even as he said it, Elara could hear the doubt in his voice. The Lord was far away and protected from the consequences of bad harvests. His steward, Robert, was paid to collect rents, not to show compassion. Mercy was a luxury that mostly flowed in one direction downward from the powerful to the weak. It rarely travelled the other way. That night, after William was asleep, Elara sat by the fire and did calculations that kept getting worse, no matter how she arranged them. If she lost half her crop and still had to pay the tithe and the Lord's rent and keep back seed grain, what was left wouldn't feed them through the winter, not unless she supplemented it somehow. She'd have to use more barley in the bread, which was cheaper but less nourishing. She'd have to gather acorns from the forest and grind them into the flour to stretch it further, even though they made the bread bitter and heavy. She'd have to do what people did in desperate times: make do, make last, make every crumb count. And there was William to think about. He was growing, needing more food, not less. If it came down to a choice between her eating and him eating, there was no choice at all. She'd go without first. Every mother would. But that didn't make the prospect any less frightening. 3 days after the rain stopped, William woke with a fever. It came on suddenly, the way childhood fevers often do. One moment he was fine, maybe a little quieter than usual. The next, he was burning up his face, flushed, his eyes too bright, his breath coming in quick, shallow pants. Elara felt the panic rise in her throat like bile. Not this. Not now. Not when everything else was already balanced on such a knife's edge. She did what she could. Bathed his forehead with cool water. Made him drink chamomile tea that she brewed from dried flowers she'd been saving. Wrapped him in blankets when he shivered. Pulled them off when he complained of being too hot. Prayed. Prayed harder than she'd prayed in years since Thomas had lain in this same bed, burning with the same kind of fever that had taken him from her. Please. She begged whatever force might be listening. Please, not William. Take anything else. Take the grain. Take the cottage. Take me if you have to. But not my boy. Not my boy. For 2 days the fever raged. William didn't know her, lost in some feverish dream, where he called out for his father and fought invisible enemies and wept for reasons she couldn't understand. She stayed by his side the entire time, leaving only to tend the fire or fetch more water. She didn't eat, barely slept, just watched and prayed and tried to will him back to health through sheer force of love. On the 3rd morning, the fever broke. She woke from an uneasy doze to find William looking at her with clear eyes, his forehead cool to the touch. "Mama," he said, his voice rough, but unmistakably his own. "I'm hungry." Elara burst into tears, great gasping sobs of relief that she'd been holding back for days. She gathered him into her arms, careful of his weakness, and rocked him the way she used to when he was small. "Thank you," she whispered, though she still wasn't entirely sure who she was thanking. "Thank you, thank you, thank you." She fed him thin broth first, not wanting to shock his system with solid food. Then, when he kept that down, a small piece of bread soaked in milk she'd begged from Margaret next door. He ate slowly, but with good appetite, and with each swallow, Elara felt some of the terrible tension leave her body. He would live. They would get through this. Somehow, despite the ruined grain and the coming winter and all the uncertainties that crowded in like wolves at the door, they would survive. But that night, as she sat by the fire while William slept peacefully for the first time in days, Elara felt the weight of it all settle onto her shoulders. The fear, the exhaustion, the grinding worry of never quite having enough. The knowledge that one bad harvest, one illness, one stroke of misfortune could be the difference between survival and starvation. She looked at the bread on the table. There was perhaps a week's worth left if she was careful. After that, she'd need to bake again using flour that was now more precious than ever. And the grain still in the field, what was left of it, would need to be harvested soon. Cut by hand through mud and wet straw, sorted to separate what was still good from what had spoiled, dried as best they could in this damp autumn air, stored, protected. It felt like too much, like more than one person should have to bear alone. But she wasn't alone, she reminded herself. There was Margaret, who'd brought the milk without being asked. There was John the miller, who'd given her the spelt seed. There was Father Benedict, who was even now negotiating with the steward on behalf of the village. There were neighbours and friends, and the whole web of human connection that caught people when they fell, that kept them from plummeting all the way into the abyss. And there was bread. There would always be bread, even if it had to be stretched with acorns and hope. Even if it was darker and denser and less satisfying than she'd like, it would still be bread, would still sustain them, would still connect her to all the generations of women who'd faced similar hardships and found ways to endure. She cut a thin slice from the loaf and ate it slowly, making it last. It was good bread, honest bread, made from grain she'd grown, and flour she'd ground, and dough she'd shaped with her own hands. Whatever came next, whatever hardships the winter brought, this bread would see them through. It always had. And somehow, by grace or luck, or the simple stubborn refusal to give up it, always would. The quarrel began over water. 3 weeks after William's fever broke, the harvest was finally in. What could be salvaged anyway? Elara had managed to save perhaps 40% of her crop, better than some, worse than others. It was enough to keep them alive through the winter if she was careful. If she was very, very careful. If nothing else went wrong. The grain was cut and bundled and drying in the tithe barn alongside everyone else's, waiting for the great communal threshing that would separate seed from chaff. And while it dried, the village had turned its attention to preparing for winter, gathering wood, repairing roofs, and most critically digging the new irrigation channels that would hopefully prevent this kind of flooding damage next year. The work was being done collectively, as such projects always were. Every household contributed labour, and in return, everyone would benefit from better drainage and more controlled water distribution. It was a system that had worked for generations, until today. The problem was that Elara's strip of land sat on slightly higher ground than her neighbour Edmund's, which meant that any water channeled along the new ditch would naturally flow downward toward his plots. Good for him. Less good for her, especially in a dry year when every drop of water would be precious. Edmund wanted the ditch along the boundary between their lands. Elara wanted it shifted several yards over to run along the far edge of her holding instead. The difference was maybe 20 feet, maybe less. But those 20 feet could mean the difference between a good harvest and a failed one. They stood facing each other across the disputed ground, both breathing hard from the argument that had been building all morning. Around them, other villagers had stopped work to watch. Disputes like this were rare in St. Arlen, and when they happened, they had to be settled properly before they poisoned the whole community. "You're being unreasonable," Edmund said, his face flushed. "The ditch makes more sense where I've marked it. It follows the natural contour of the land. The natural contour that puts all the water on your side and leaves mine dry." Elara shot back. "How convenient for you." "This isn't about convenience. It's about good planning. Ask anyone here. Ask Gerard. Ask John." "I don't need to ask anyone. I know my own land. I know what it needs. What it needs is a neighbor who isn't so damn stubborn." The words hung in the air between them, sharp and ugly. Elara felt anger rise hot in her chest. She opened her mouth to say something, cutting something that would put Edmund in his place. Something about how at least she'd managed to save 40% of her crop, while he'd lost almost 2/3 through his own careless management. But then she stopped. Because in that moment, she saw not Edmund the neighbor she was quarreling with, but Edmund the person. Edmund, who'd lost his wife 2 winters ago. Edmund, who was trying to raise 3 young daughters alone. Edmund, whose face, now that she really looked at it, was drawn and tired, and edged with the same desperate worry she saw in her own reflection every morning. They were both scared, both struggling, both trying to survive in a world that felt increasingly precarious. And here they were turning on each other over 20 feet of dirt, when the real enemy, the rain, the cold, the indifferent nobility, the grinding poverty that defined their lives, was something they should be facing together. She took a breath, let it out slowly. "Edmund," she said, and was surprised by how gentle her voice sounded. "How are your daughters?" He blinked clearly, thrown by the change in subject. "What?" "Your daughters, Sarah and Mary and little Anne. How are they?" They're well enough." "Why?" "And your harvest. You got what you needed threshed." "Most of it. There's still some wet straw to deal with, but we'll manage." "That's good. I'm glad." Edmund's defensive posture slowly relaxed. "What are you doing, Elara?" "I'm trying to remember that we're neighbors," she said. "I'm trying to remember that 20 years from now, the exact placement of this ditch isn't going to matter nearly as much as whether or not we were decent to each other today." She could feel the watching villagers leaning in, listening. Could feel the moment balanced on a knife edge between escalation and resolution. "I'm scared," she said simply. "I'm scared that there won't be enough, that the winter will be too hard, that I won't be able to keep William fed and warm and safe. And when I'm scared, I fight, even over things that maybe aren't worth fighting over. I'm sorry for that." Edmund was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "I'm scared too, all the damn time. And you're right. I was thinking about my convenience, about making my life a little easier at your expense. That's not how we're supposed to do things here. So, what do? We compromise. We put the ditch exactly between where you want it and where I want it. And if that doesn't work as well as either of us hoped, we adjust it next year. Together. After we see how the water actually flows." Elara felt something loosen in her chest. "That seems fair." "And," Edmund hesitated, "and maybe in the spring when you're planting that new spelt John gave you, I could help. I've got experience with spelt. My father used to grow it up north before we moved here. I'd like that. Thank you." They stood there for a moment, not quite friends, but no longer adversaries. Just two people trying their best in impossible circumstances. And around them, the village seemed to collectively exhale the tension draining away like water after a storm. That evening, after the work was done and the ditch was dug to everyone's satisfaction, Elara walked home slowly, thinking about what had almost happened. How close she'd come to saying things that couldn't be unsaid, to burning a bridge she might desperately need later. How easy it was to let fear turn you small and mean and grasping. When she reached her cottage, she found a small bundle wrapped in cloth sitting by her door. She picked it up and opened it to find a half loaf of bread, still slightly warm, and a scrap of paper with crude writing that she recognized as Edmund's hand. "For William, baked this morning." She stood there, holding it, this simple gift from a man she'd been ready to fight with hours earlier, and felt tears prick at her eyes. This was what bread meant, she thought. Not just sustenance for the body, but sustenance for the spirit. It was the currency of kindness, the language of, "I see you, I care about you, we're in this together." Inside, William was already asleep, exhausted from playing with the other children during the workday. Elara wrapped Edmund's bread carefully and placed it in the chest with her own flour. Tomorrow she'd bake too, and she'd make sure to take a portion to Edmund's daughters. The cycle of giving and receiving would continue. She prepared her own dough for the morning's baking, mixing flour and water, and a spoonful of the starter that bubbled gently in its crock. Her hands knew the rhythm without thought, fold, turn, fold again. The dough was cool and slightly sticky, alive with the yeasts that were already beginning their work of transformation. As she worked, she thought about choices, about the moment in the field when she could have gone one way or another, could have escalated or de-escalated, could have chosen her fear or her better nature. In the stories the priests told, such moments were always dramatic and clear. The saint resisted temptation. The sinner gave in. The righteous were rewarded and the wicked punished. But real life was messier than that. Real life was standing in a muddy field, exhausted and scared, trying to decide whether the 20 feet of drainage ditch was worth losing a neighbor over. And bread, she realized, had been her teacher in making that choice. Because bread required patience, required you to think not just about today, but about tomorrow and next week and next season. Required you to save seed instead of eating it all now. Required you to share with others so that when your turn came to need help, there would be someone willing to give it. Bread was delayed gratification made physical. It was trust in the future, even when the present was hard. It was the opposite of grasping, of hoarding, of get mine before someone else does. She placed the dough in its bowl and covered it with a cloth. By morning, it would have risen, transformed by time and warmth and the invisible work of tiny creatures, into something lighter, airier, more than it was now. And that too felt like a lesson. That sometimes the best thing you could do was step back and let the transformation happen. Trust the process. Have faith that what was hard and dense now would become sustaining and good. The candle on the table was burning low. Elara banked the fire for the night and climbed into bed, pulling the thin blanket up to her chin. Through the small window, she could see stars beginning to emerge as the evening clouds cleared. The same stars that had looked down on her grandfather and his grandfather before him. The same stars that would, God willing, look down on William's grandchildren someday. She thought about Edmund's daughters sleeping in their cottage across the village, thought about Margaret next door, and old Gerard and John the miller, and all the other lives woven together in this small place. They depended on each other in ways that went beyond economics or duty. They were in the deepest sense a community, and communities survived not by fighting over every advantage, but by sharing the burden and the blessing in roughly equal measure. Tomorrow, she would bake. She would take bread to Edmund's family. She would continue the work of living day by day, choice by choice, trying to be a little better than her fears wanted her to be. It wasn't heroic. It wasn't dramatic. But it was enough. It had to be enough. Outside, the wind picked up slightly, carrying with it the smell of wood smoke and damp earth and the distant promise of winter. Inside, Elara closed her eyes and let sleep take her. Her last conscious thought, a simple prayer: "Thank you for today. Help me do better tomorrow." And in the bowl on the table, the dough quietly rose. The next morning arrived cold and clear, the kind of autumn morning where your breath mists in front of your face and the grass crunches slightly with the first hints of frost. Elara woke before dawn, as she always did, and immediately turned her attention to the bread. The dough had risen beautifully overnight, nearly doubling in size, its surface stretched and smooth and faintly domed like a pregnant belly. She uncovered it and felt the warmth radiating from it, the result of all those invisible yeasts working through the dark hours, consuming sugars and producing carbon dioxide, and transforming simple flour and water into something alive. She punched it down gently, hearing the soft sigh of escaping air, then divided it into 2 portions. One she shaped into a round loaf for her own family. The other she shaped slightly smaller, more carefully, with edges tucked and smoothed until it looked almost pretty. This one was for Edmund's daughters. While the shaped loaves rose for the final time, she tended the fire, building it up to a proper baking heat. Getting the temperature right was an art form learned over years of practice. Too hot, and the outside would burn before the inside cooked. Too cool, and the bread would be dense and heavy, never developing that perfect crisp crust that made the first slice so satisfying. When the fire had burned down to glowing coals and the air above it shimmered with heat, she swept the hearth clean and placed her loaves directly on the hot stones. Then she covered them with her precious iron pot, turned upside down, and piled more hot coals on top of it. This created a kind of oven within the oven, with heat coming from all sides, ensuring an even bake. And then came the waiting, the hardest part in some ways, the part where you had to trust that you'd done everything right, that the dough would rise and brown and turn into bread instead of remaining an inedible lump. It was, she supposed, a lot like life itself. You did your best, made your choices, and then you had to have faith that it would all work out. William woke to the smell of baking bread, which was exactly as it should be. He came down from the loft, rubbing his eyes, drawn to the hearth like a moth to flame. "Is that for us?" he asked hopefully. "One is. The other is for Edmund's daughters." Because of the water fight? Elara smiled. Of course he knew about it. The whole village probably knew. There were no secrets in a place this small. Not because of it, despite it, to remind ourselves that neighbors are more important than arguments. She checked the bread, lifting the pot carefully to peer inside. The loaves had risen well, and the tops were beginning to brown nicely. Another 20 minutes, she judged, maybe a little less. "Can I come with you when you take it?" William asked. "If you like, but you'll need to wash your face first and put on clean clothes. We're going to be proper about this." He scurried off to obey, and Elara smiled at his enthusiasm. Children understood gift-giving instinctively. They knew that the joy was as much in the giving as the receiving, maybe more so. Adults had to relearn that lesson over and over, had to fight against the scarcity mindset that said, "If I give to you, there's less for me." But bread multiplied when it was shared in a way. Not literally, of course. But the goodwill it created, the connections, it strengthened the community it built. Those were forms of abundance that mattered just as much as full bellies. When the bread was done, she pulled it from the fire and set it on the table to cool. The crust was perfect, deep golden brown, crisp and crackly, with splits along the top where the steam had escaped during baking. She tapped the bottom of each loaf, listening for the hollow thump that meant it was cooked all the way through. Yes, good bread, honest bread. She wrapped Edmund's loaf while it was still warm, swaddling it in a clean cloth like a baby. The warmth would help it stay soft for the journey, and there was something about a warm loaf that felt extra generous, extra caring. It was bread that said, "I woke early for this. I thought of you first thing." They walked across the village in the bright morning, William skipping ahead and then doubling back, unable to contain his energy. Other villagers were up and about now, tending animals, hauling water, starting their own days. Hands were raised in greeting words called out. It was a good morning, a blessed morning, the kind that made you think maybe the winter wouldn't be so bad after all. Edmund's cottage was smaller than Elara's, more weathered, with a patch of thatch on the roof that clearly needed replacing before the snow came. She knocked on the door, and after a moment it opened to reveal Edmund himself, looking surprised and a bit suspicious. "Elara, William, what brings you here so early?" "Bread," Elara said simply, holding out the wrapped loaf. "Fresh from the oven this morning, for your daughters." Edmund stared at the offering like he didn't quite know what to do with it. Then slowly, understanding crossed his face, followed by something that might have been emotion. "You didn't have to do this. I know, but I wanted to. Yesterday I wasn't my best self. This is my apology, and my thanks for the bread you left at my door." "That was just a half loaf. This is a whole one." "Well, you have more mouths to feed than I do. It seems fair." From inside the cottage came the sound of children's voices, excited and high-pitched. 3 little girls appeared in the doorway, pressing against their father's legs, staring up at Elara and William with curious eyes. "Girls," Edmund said gruffly, "say thank you to Mistress Elara. She's brought us fresh bread." "Thank you, Mistress Elara." They chorused their voices like birdsong. Elara felt her heart squeeze. They were so small. Sarah, the oldest, couldn't be more than 6. Mary, perhaps 4. And little Anne, clinging to her father's sleeve, barely 2. How did Edmund manage? How did he keep them fed and safe and clean? The work of it must be overwhelming, especially now with winter coming and his harvest so diminished. "Would you like to come in?" Edmund offered, stepping back from the doorway. "I've got tea brewing. It's not much, but—" "We'd love to," Elara said, before she'd quite thought it through. "But yes, Yes, she wanted to sit with this family for a moment, wanted to see how they lived, wanted to understand her neighbour better than she had. The inside of the cottage was cramped but surprisingly tidy. Someone, probably Sarah, had made an effort to sweep the floor and arrange things neatly. There was a pot of something bubbling over the fire, thin porridge by the smell of it. And on the small table, a few carved wooden toys that Edmund must have made in the evenings after the girls were asleep. They sat, and Edmund poured weak tea into wooden cups. The bread was unwrapped and placed in the center of the table, like a centerpiece, like something to be celebrated. And it was Elara realized. To this family, a whole fresh loaf was a luxury, a gift beyond measure. "May I?" Edmund asked, gesturing to the bread. "Please, it's yours." He cut it with careful reverence, making sure each daughter got a slice of equal size. The girls ate with concentration, savoring every bite, and Elara had to look away for a moment, because the hunger in their thin faces was almost too much to bear. "We'll have a good harvest next year," Edmund said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. "The new drainage will help, and I've been saving better seed. Things will improve. They will." Elara agreed, though she wasn't sure if she believed it. But sometimes belief wasn't about certainty. Sometimes it was just about choosing hope over despair, even when you had no guarantee it was justified. They talked for a while about ordinary things. The weather, the upcoming village feast day, the roof repair that Edmund was planning. And slowly, Elara began to see Edmund not as an adversary, or even just a neighbour, but as a person, a father trying his best, a man carrying grief and responsibility with as much grace as he could manage, just like her. When they stood to leave, little Anne toddled over and wrapped her arms around Elara's leg in an unexpected hug. Elara bent down and stroked the child's wispy hair, feeling something crack open in her chest. "You're always welcome here," Edmund said from the doorway. "And not just when you're bringing bread. Anytime, if you need help with something, or just company. The girls like having visitors." "The same to you," Elara replied. "William gets lonely sometimes being an only child. He'd probably enjoy having some smaller children to boss around occasionally." They smiled at each other, a real smile this time with warmth behind it. Walking back to her own cottage, William said thoughtfully, "Those girls are very hungry, aren't they?" "They are." "Should we give them more bread? We have enough, don't we?" Elara stopped walking and looked down at her son. 7 years old, and already understanding this fundamental truth that having enough meant you had an obligation to share with those who didn't. "We'll give them more," she promised. "Not so much that they feel ashamed or that we go without ourselves, but enough to help, enough to make a difference. That's the balance we try to strike." "Like the bread dough," William said. "Not too much water, not too little. Just right." Exactly like that. That afternoon, Elara baked again. She'd been planning to wait a few days to conserve her flour. But plans could change. Needed to change sometimes when you saw a greater need than your own. This time, she made 3 loaves. 1 for her household, 1 for Edmund's girls, and 1 for old Gerard, who lived alone and whose hands were too knotted with age to knead dough properly anymore. And as she worked the dough, as she felt it transform under her hands from sticky and resistant to smooth and elastic, she thought about transformation more generally, about how people could change too if given the right conditions, how anger could soften into understanding, how fear could open into compassion, how isolation could warm into community. It wasn't quick, this transformation. It took time and intention and the right environment, just like bread. But it was possible. She'd seen it happen yesterday in the field. Was seeing it happen now in her own heart, which felt larger, somehow more expansive, as if there was room in it for more than just her own worries. The bread rose, the fire heated. The afternoon light slanted through the small window, turning the cottage interior golden. And when the loaves emerged from the oven, crackling and fragrant and perfect, Elara wrapped them while they were still warm and took them out into the village. To Edmund's cottage, where the girls squealed with delight. To Gerard's door, where the old man's eyes went misty with gratitude. "Bless you, child," he said, his voice rough. "This is more than kind." "It's just bread," Elara protested. "It's never just bread," Gerard replied, which was something her grandfather used to say, and hearing it again made her throat tight with memory. Walking home in the gathering dusk, Elara felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not happiness exactly. Life was still hard, and the future still uncertain. But something close to peace. A sense that she was living rightly, that the choices she was making, small as they were, mattered. The bells of St. Arlen rang the evening call to prayer. Smoke rose from cottage chimneys. Somewhere a dog barked. Ordinary sounds, ordinary life, but infused somehow with grace. She thought about the bread she'd given away today, thought about how it would nourish not just bodies, but spirits, how it would be eaten with gratitude and remembered with warmth. How such small acts of kindness rippled outward in ways you could never fully track or measure. And she thought about the bread on her own table, waiting for her and William, how it had come from grain she'd grown, and flour she'd milled, and dough she'd shaped, how it connected her to the earth and the seasons, and all the generations who'd done this same work before her. In 1324, in a village outside York, in the life of a widow named Elara, bread was everything. Food and currency and gift and symbol and sacrament all wrapped into one. And on this evening, as the stars began to emerge and the world settled into night, it was also proof that kindness was possible, that generosity didn't require wealth, that even when you had little, you could still give much. The dough rose, the bread baked, the gift was given, and the world for one small moment was warm. The evening after Elara's bread giving, something happened that hadn't happened in the 3 years since Thomas died. Someone knocked on her door after dark. Not a desperate knock, not an emergency. Just a gentle tap followed by a familiar voice calling softly. "Elara, it's Margaret. May I come in?" Elara opened the door to find her neighbour standing in the cold darkness, wrapped in her heaviest cloak, carrying a small basket covered with cloth. Behind her, the village was settling into night lights, winking out one by one as families banked their fires and sought their beds. Come in, Elara said, stepping aside. "Is everything all right?" "Everything's fine," Margaret assured her, entering and shaking the cold from her shoulders. I wanted to visit, if you're not too tired." "Never too tired for company. William's already asleep, but we can talk by the fire." They settled themselves on the 2 stools near the hearth, and Margaret uncovered her basket to reveal a small crock of butter and a handful of dried apples. "I thought we might have a treat," she said with a shy smile. "A little celebration." Of what? Of you. Of what you did today with Edmund and Gerard. The whole village is talking about it. How you turned a quarrel into friendship. How you gave bread when you could have hoarded it. Elara felt her cheeks warm though, whether from the fire or embarrassment she couldn't say. I just did what anyone would do. But not everyone does, do they? That's the thing. It's easy to say we should be kind, should be generous, should think of others. But actually doing it, especially when you're scared and uncertain yourself, that takes courage. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, watching the flames dance and listening to the small domestic sounds of the cottage. The creak of cooling wood, the rustle of dried herbs hanging from the rafters, the soft snoring of William in the loft above. "I've been thinking about bread," Margaret said suddenly. Elara laughed. "Seems to be going around." "No, I mean really thinking about it, about what it means. My grandmother used to say that you could tell everything you needed to know about a person by watching how they broke bread. Whether they took the best piece for themselves or offered it to others. Whether they ate greedily or with gratitude. Whether they shared without being asked or hoarded without shame. Your grandmother sounds wise. She was. And she made the best bread I've ever tasted, better even than yours, if you'll forgive me saying so." Margaret smiled to take any sting from the words. She had this way of kneading it very gently, almost like she was petting it. She said, "You had to treat dough with respect, because it was alive." Said, if you were angry or upset when you made bread, you'd put that anger into the dough, and everyone who ate it would taste it. I've heard something similar, never quite believed it. I don't know if it's literally true, but I think there's something to it in a metaphorical sense at least. The energy you put into making food affects how it's received. The care you take, the intention you hold, it matters. Elara thought about the bread she'd made that morning, how she'd shaped Edmund's loaf with extra attention, smoothing the edges and making it as beautiful as she could. How she'd thought about his daughters while she worked, hoping the bread would bring them comfort. "Maybe you're right," she said quietly. Margaret reached into her basket again and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in leaves. "I brought you something. Seeds. Flax, actually. I've got more than I need, and I thought you might want to grow some next year. The seeds can be ground into the bread flour for extra nutrition, and the fibers make excellent thread if you know how to process them." Another gift of seeds. First John with his spelt, now Margaret with flax. It felt like the village itself was investing in her future, telling her in this wordless way that they believed she would still be here next year, still farming, still surviving. "Thank you," Elara said, taking the bundle with both hands. "I'll plant them in the spring, and I'll save seed from my harvest to pass along to someone else. That's what John told me to do with the spelt. Keep them alive by sharing them. That's the way it's always been done. The old varieties, the reliable ones, they've been passed from hand to hand for generations, longer than anyone can remember. There's something beautiful about that, don't you think? About being part of a chain that stretches backward to your ancestors and forward to people you'll never meet." They talked deep into the night, sharing those dried apples and butter on thin slices of bread, their conversation wandering from practical matters to philosophical ones, and back again. They talked about children and harvests, and the difficulty of being a woman alone in a world that expected you to have a man's protection. They talked about winter preparations and which herbs were best for which ailments, and whether Father Benedict's new altar cloth was really an improvement over the old one. And beneath all of it, unspoken but deeply felt, was the simple comfort of companionship, of not being alone, of having someone to talk to after the long day's work was done and the darkness pressed close. "Do you ever feel," Margaret said hesitantly, "like the bread is more than just food? Like it's, I don't know, a kind of prayer?" "Yes," Elara said immediately. "Yes, exactly that. Because every time I knead dough, I find myself thinking about the people who will eat it, hoping it nourishes them, hoping it brings them strength and comfort. And that feels like prayer to me, even if I'm not saying any words. My grandfather called it working meditation. He said the repetitive tasks, the ones your hands knew so well you didn't have to think about them, those were the times when you could really talk to God, or to yourself, or to the universe, however you wanted to think of it. "I miss that generation," Margaret said softly. "They knew things we're forgetting. They had a kind of wisdom that came from living close to the earth, from understanding that you were part of something larger than yourself. We still have that wisdom. We're living it even if we don't always recognize it. Are we? Sometimes I worry that we're losing it, that the world is changing in ways we don't fully understand, that our children will live in a different world than we did, and not necessarily a better one." Elara thought about William asleep in the loft, thought about what kind of world he would inherit. Would there still be communal fields and shared ovens and neighbors who brought each other bread? Or would something shift, some fundamental change that would alter the fabric of village life? "All we can do is teach them what we know," she said finally. "Teach them to be kind, to share, to value things that last over things that glitter, and trust that they'll carry those lessons forward even if the world around them changes." The candle on the table had burned down to a nub, its flame guttering in the wax. Margaret rose to leave, gathering her cloak and empty basket. "Thank you for tonight," she said at the door. "I needed this more than I realized." "Come again," Elara replied. "Any time. The door's always open to you." After Margaret left, Elara sat by the fire a while longer, thinking about the evening, about the gifts that had been exchanged, not just seeds and butter and apples, but something more precious, time and attention, and the vulnerable sharing of thoughts you didn't say out loud to just anyone. This, too, was what bread meant in a community. Not just the literal loaves passed from hand to hand, but the whole ecosystem of care and connection that grew up around the making and sharing of food. The conversations that happened while waiting for dough to rise. The friendships forged over communal ovens. The sense of being woven into a larger whole of mattering to people and having people matter to you. She banked the fire for the night, covering the coals with ash so they'd stay alive until morning. Then she climbed into bed, pulling the thin blanket up and listening to the familiar sounds of the cottage at rest. Tomorrow, she would bake again, would tend her remaining grain and plan for spring planting, would navigate all the small challenges that made up a life. But tonight, she could simply be grateful. Grateful for Margaret's friendship, for Edmund's forgiveness, for Gerard's blessing, for all the small kindnesses that made survival possible and life worth living. The darkness outside was complete, now the kind of darkness that only existed before electricity. deep and velvety and absolute. But inside, in the warm safety of her cottage, with William breathing softly above and the embers glowing on the hearth, Elara felt held, protected, part of something larger than her individual struggles. She thought about the bread she'd bake tomorrow, how she'd measure the flour carefully, add water, gradually knead with patience, how she'd let it rise in its own time, refusing to rush the process, how she'd bake it with attention and care, and how, when it emerged golden and fragrant from the oven, she'd cut the first slice while it was still warm and offer it to William with love. This was her prayer, her meditation, her act of faith. That bread would rise tomorrow as it had risen today, that there would be enough to share. That kindness given would return as kindness received, that the simple acts of daily living done with intention and care could add up to something meaningful, something sacred. Outside, an owl called from the forest edge. The wind whispered through the thatch. The village slept 30 cottages full of people doing their best to survive, and when possible, to thrive. And in her cottage, in her bed, Elara closed her eyes and let sleep take her. Her last conscious thought was a simple observation. In a world that could be harsh and uncertain, bread was certainty. Bread was comfort. Bread was the thing you could count on season after season, year after year. And sometimes, when you were very fortunate, bread was also love. Winter, when it came, was gentler than expected. Oh, there were hard days, certainly. Days when the wind cut through even the thickest wool, and the ground froze solid, and the water in the bucket by the door turned to ice overnight. Days when getting out of bed required an act of will, because the cold was so complete, so encompassing, that movement itself seemed an affront to the natural order of hibernation. But there were no catastrophes, no killing storms, no extended periods of starvation. The grain that Elara had managed to save from the autumn floods stretched with careful additions of barley and peas, and yes, occasionally ground acorns lasted. William stayed healthy. The cottage stayed standing. They survived. And now, incredibly, it was spring again. Elara stood in her field in the pale dawn light, the same field where she'd stood 6 months ago, watching the rain destroy her harvest, and marveled at the difference. The earth was soft again, ready to accept seed. The air smelled of growth rather than decay. And in her hand, she held 3 kinds of grain, the einkorn her family had always grown, the spelt John had given her, and now the flax from Margaret. William was with her, carrying the seed bag and trying very hard to look serious and responsible. He'd grown over the winter, shot up several inches, and his face had lost some of its childish roundness. He was becoming a person, she realized. Not just her baby, but someone with his own thoughts and observations and character. "Tell me again how to do it," he said, watching her hands. "You broadcast it." She demonstrated, taking a handful of mixed seed and flinging it in a wide arc across the prepared soil. "Not too thick, or the plants will crowd each other. Not too thin, or you're wasting space. Just enough. You'll learn the feel of it after a while." She let him try, and he flung the seed with perhaps a bit too much enthusiasm. But she didn't correct him. Let him learn. Let him make small mistakes now so he could avoid large ones later. They worked together in companionable silence, moving methodically across the strip of land. The sun rose higher, warming their backs. Birds called from the hedgerows, and all around them other villagers were doing the same work, participating in the same ancient ritual of planting and hoping and trusting in the future. When they finished Elara's strip, they moved to help Edmund with his. This too had become part of their routine over the winter. The shared labour, the mutual support. What had started as a quarrel over water had transformed into genuine friendship, and now their two families worked together more often than not. Edmund's daughters were there too, even little Anne, who was really too young to be much help, but who toddled around collecting pretty stones and chattering to herself in the self-absorbed way of 2-year-olds. They'd all grown over the winter, fed partly by their father's labour, but also Elara knew by the steady stream of extra bread and soup and whatever else the village had managed to share. "Good morning," Edmund called when he saw them approaching. "Come to save me from my daughters." "We've come to help," Elara corrected, smiling. "All hands make light work." "And many hands make the work lighter still," he replied, which was an old saying, but no less true for its age. They worked together until mid-morning, when the sun was high enough to make the labour sweaty. Then they stopped and shared a meal together, sitting on the ground at the edge of the field. Bread, of course, and cheese that Edmund had somehow acquired, and small beer that Elara had brewed last week. The bread was made from the last of the winter stores, which meant it was a bit rougher than usual, a bit more creative in its composition. But it was still good, still sustaining, still the centre of the meal and the conversation. "I've been thinking about the summer," Edmund said between bites. "About maybe starting a small enterprise. Eggs, perhaps. I've got space for a few more chickens and the girls could help tend them. Sell the extra eggs at market for a bit of cash money." "That's a good thought," Elara encouraged. "William and I could help build the coop if you need it. I might take you up on that, and in return, you'd get first pick of the eggs. Fair trade." This was how it worked, Elara thought. This endless exchange of labour and goods and favours that wove a community together more surely than any law or contract. "I help you plant, you help me harvest. I teach your daughter to spin, you teach my son to carve. I bake extra bread, you share your eggs." Round and round it went, a circular economy of care that kept everyone afloat. After the meal, they went back to work. The planting had to be finished while the weather held, and the soil was in the right condition. Too wet, and the seeds would rot. Too dry, and they wouldn't germinate. There was a narrow window of perfect conditions, and experience taught you to recognize it and act quickly. By the time they finished Edmund's field, it was past noon. Elara and William walked home, tired but satisfied, their muscles pleasantly sore from useful work. "Mama," William said as they walked, "do you think the grain will grow this year? Do you think it will be enough?" It was a child's question looking for reassurance, but Elara had learned not to lie to him, even when the truth was uncertain. "I think it will grow," she said carefully. "Grain almost always does if you plant it properly and the weather cooperates. Whether it will be enough, that depends on many things. The rain and sun, whether any sickness comes to the plants, whether soldiers pass through and trample the fields, whether the Lord demands more rent than we can afford. But we'll do our best and hope for the best and deal with whatever comes." "And we'll make bread," William said with certainty. "And we'll make bread," she agreed, smiling. "Yes, always bread." That evening, as the light began to fail, Elara prepared the dough for tomorrow's baking. It had become her favourite time of day, this quiet ritual performed while William was drowsy and the world was winding down. The mixing and kneading gave her hands something to do while her mind wandered and settled. She thought about the year behind them, the floods and fear and near misses, the moments of despair and the moments of grace, how she'd almost lost William to fever, how she'd almost lost Edmund to pride and anger, how she'd almost lost herself to the grinding pressure of trying to survive alone. But she hadn't lost any of it. Through luck or providence, or the simple stubborn refusal to give up, they'd all made it through. And now, here they were on the other side of winter, planting again, beginning again, choosing hope again. The dough came together under her hands, transforming from separate ingredients into a unified whole, flour and water, and a bit of last week's starter, nothing more. But from these simple things, bread would come, nourishment would come, life would come. She placed the bowl near the hearth where the warmth would help the fermentation, covered it with a cloth, and whispered a prayer so old she'd forgotten where she learned it. Bless this bread, and the hands that made it, and all who eat of it. Let it nourish body and soul. Amen. She climbed into bed and lay in the darkness, listening to William's breathing above and the usual night sounds outside. An owl, the wind, the distant bark of a fox, the world at rest, gathering strength for tomorrow. And somewhere in her chest, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not just contentment, though there was that. Not just relief at having survived another winter, though there was that too. But something more fundamental, something like trust. Trust that the seeds would sprout, that the grain would grow, that there would be flour and bread and enough to share. Trust that Edmund would remain a friend, that Margaret would continue to visit, that the village would continue to hold together through whatever challenges came. Trust that William would grow strong and capable, that he would remember these lessons about kindness and generosity and the patient work of nurturing things, that he would carry forward the knowledge of bread making and field tending and community building into his own life and his own children's lives. Trust that she herself would be all right, that the lonely nights would become less lonely over time, that the grief for Thomas would soften into sweet memory, that the fear of not having enough would fade as she learned again and again that enough kept appearing just when she needed it most. Outside, the first stars were emerging in the darkening sky. The same stars her grandfather had seen. The same stars her grandmother had seen. The same stars that would shine on William's grandchildren long after Elara herself had returned to the earth that had fed her all her life. There was a continuity to that, a comfort in being part of something larger than one brief life. In knowing that the bread she made today was part of an unbroken chain stretching backward thousands of years, and forward, God willing, thousands more. The dough was rising in its bowl, quietly transforming. Tomorrow it would become bread, and the bread would become strength, and the strength would become labor, and the labor would become grain, and the grain would become bread again. The cycle continued, the wheel turned, and in 1324, in a village outside York, in the life of a widow named Elara, that was enough. That was everything. And so, we come to the end of our journey tonight. Back through the centuries, back from that small village outside York, back to your own time and place, and the bed where you lie listening. I hope Elara's story has brought you some peace, some comfort, perhaps even some perspective on your own life with its own challenges and blessings and daily rituals that connect you to all the humans who have come before. Because that's the truth of it, isn't it? We're not so different from Elara and her neighbors. We still need food and shelter and community. We still struggle with fear and loss and the uncertainty of the future. We still search for meaning in the repetitive tasks that make up most of our lives. And we still need bread in one form or another. Maybe not literal loaves baked in hearth ovens, though some of us make those too. But we need sustenance. We need the things that nourish us, body and soul. We need the rituals that ground us and connect us and remind us who we are. Elara would have been amazed by your world, by its abundance and technology and comfort. But she might also have been troubled by some of what we've lost. The deep connection to our food, the sense of community that comes from genuine interdependence, the knowledge that what we do matters, that our labor has meaning, beyond just earning money to buy things. Medieval peasants lived on bread, yes, but more than that, they lived through bread. It was the organizing principle of their lives, the thing that required their attention and rewarded their effort and taught them patience and faith and gratitude. What's the bread in your life? What's the thing that requires your daily attention, that connects you to something larger than yourself, that teaches you to be patient and faithful and grateful? Think about that as continue 1455 orchestrated peaceful outro completion with thematic closure. I need to finish the outro within the character count. Let me check where I am and complete it properly with the required elements. The outro should bring the listener back gently to the present. Include the key message about bread as kindness. Have the signature fade-out phrases. End with the required line. In those days, bread was never just food. It was kindness made warm. Be peaceful and sleep-inducing. Let me continue and complete it properly. You drift off to sleep tonight. Think about the cycles in your own life, the daily rituals that might feel mundane but are actually sacred. The small acts of kindness that ripple outward in ways you'll never fully see. The choice made again and again to share rather than hoard to connect, rather than isolate to hope rather than despair. Elara's bread was made from grain she planted and tended and harvested herself. Flour she carried to the miller and brought back home. Dough she mixed and kneaded and patiently waited to rise. It was bread that represented not just calories but care. Not just nutrition, but intention. Not just food, but love made tangible. In those days, bread was never just food. It was kindness made warm. And perhaps that's what we need to remember in our own time. That the things we make, the things we give, the things we share, they're never just those things. They're always more. They're statements of value. They're acts of faith. They're small rebellions against a world that too often prizes efficiency over humanity, speed over quality, taking over giving. So as you close your eyes tonight, as sleep begins to find, you imagine yourself in Elara's cottage. Feel the warmth of the fire, smell the bread baking, hear the quiet sounds of a life lived close to the earth and close to other people. Let that peace settle into your bones. Tomorrow will come with its own challenges, its own demands, its own opportunities to choose kindness over fear, generosity over scarcity, connection over isolation. But that's tomorrow. Tonight, you can simply rest. The grain is planted, the dough is rising, the bread will bake in its own good time. And you can sleep, peaceful and safe, held by the same cycles that held Elara and her ancestors before her. The cycles of planting and harvest of work, and rest of day and night, of life and death and life again. Let the story fade now. Let the village of St. Arlen slip back into history where it belongs. Let Elara and William and Edmund and Margaret and all the others return to their rest after their long day's labour. And you, drift, float, release your grip on the waking world. The bells of St. Arlen are ringing one last time, soft and distant, and fading into memory. The grain fields whisper their ancient songs. The bread rises in the darkness, patient and sure. And somewhere across the centuries, Elara is placing a warm loaf on her table and smiling because she knows what you're only beginning to remember, that bread, real bread, the kind that matters, is never made alone. It's made with the help of the earth and the sun and the rain, with the help of the miller and the baker and the neighbour who shares their seed, with the help of patience and time and the mysterious work of tiny creatures too small to see but powerful enough to transform. And it's made with love, always love, even when times are hard, especially when times are hard. Thank you for joining me on this journey tonight. Thank you for trusting me with your precious sleeping hours. I hope the story of Elara and her bread stays with you in some small corner of your mind as a reminder that kindness is always possible, that generosity doesn't require abundance, that the simple acts of daily living done with intention and care can be their own kind of prayer. Sleep well, friend. Wherever you are in the world, whatever burdens you're carrying, whatever worries press on your mind, set them down now, just for tonight. They'll be there in the morning if you need them. But for now, let there be only this: the warmth of your bed, the softness of your pillow, the gentle rhythm of your breath, in and out, slow and steady, like the rhythm of kneading dough, like the turning of the seasons, like the endless cycle of grain and flour and bread and life. In and out, slow and steady. Rest now. Rest. The bread is rising, the world is turning, and you are safe. Sleep comes like a gentle friend, like a warm blanket, like the smell of bread baking in the morning. Let it come. Welcome it. Trust it. And remember as you drift into dreams, in those days bread was never just food. It was kindness made warm. Good night.